Hello and welcome to IGRec Talks. My name is Angelina Davidova and I'm a fellow of the Institute for Global Reconstitution. This talk is the second one in the series of video conversations with researchers, sociologists, experts, analysts, journalists about the current and new global security architecture. We're trying to analyze what's currently happening in the world with the growing security risks. We're trying to come up with solutions. We're trying to dream, and we're also trying to speak about our dreams and hopes for a more secure future. The Institute for Global Reconstitution is behind this series of talks. It's an academic Denkfabrik, analytical or research center, which has been created in 2024 by the left-wing Russian academics and practitioners who were forced to leave the country after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We work primarily on three topics: environmental climate, with a focus on extractivism, political economy, and the new global security architecture. We already had our first conversation, and in the first talk we were speaking with Artemy Magun and Felix Yeitner from the Institute for Global Reconstitution, and also with Ingar Zolty, who is a senior fellow for peace and security politics at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. And here we go with our second talk. So very warm welcome to our second talk. And today we have two wonderful guests: Alexandra Dienes, who is a senior researcher with the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in the Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace in Europe in Vienna. Welcome, Alexandra.
Hello, thank you for the invitation.
And we also have Ivan Kurilla, who is a historian and professor at Wellesley College. Welcome, Ivan.
Hi.
Hi, so great to have you here on our talk today. And the main topic of our discussion is the new security infrastructure for Europe globally. And we will be talking about quite a lot of topics. But to start our discussion, I would like to ask the same question to both of you. And this question is, where are we now? How would you describe our current situation in terms of security? So, Alexandra, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. Well, the first word that comes to my mind is uncertainty. I think all of us look to the other side of the Atlantic. I'm speaking from Europe, and don't know what to expect in the next moves from the Trump administration. And it's the moment where we realize we need finally to get our act together. It's the time when major European nations such as France, Germany, who is now about to form a new government, United Kingdom, realize they need to start seriously thinking about taking security into their own hands. So this is the high time for strategic autonomy, something that was in the drawer for a long time. And now, regarding all the insecurity we're having regarding the still ongoing Russia's war against Ukraine, I think this pivotal moment where Europe starts thinking how to actually stabilize European security. We'll be speaking about this a lot today, but at the moment, this is the big time of uncertainty and that we don't quite know where it's heading.
Thank you. Ivan, what's your take on that?
I would say that we are living through the period of the final dismantling of Yalta system or of the Cold War. We still, more than 30 years after the Cold War was declared ended, we still lived in an international community, international systems which were formed, shaped during the Cold War. What we now see is a final dismantling of the Cold War systems initiated suddenly by the American administration. What we see, how can I interpret what Trump is doing? Trump is just withdrawing from the obligation that the United States took upon itself at the beginning of the Cold War. And it stopped looking at Russia as a threat because Russia is no more communist. Russia is no more communist for almost 40 years already. But now it looks like, okay, Russia is an imperial country. It's maybe dangerous to its neighbors, but it's not a global opponent to the United States. So why should we contain Russia? What should we deter Russia. This is not a communism, and that is something of a different type of thinking in the Washington and the White House. Of course, from Europe it looks very differently, but from the United States it looks like, okay, we put the final stop at the Cold War logic, and well, what else? What will be suggested instead of that logic? It's not clear yet, but certainly this is a period of uncertainty. I would agree with Alexandra. Yeah.
Well, it certainly sounds like a very big shift, and it certainly sounds like a historic moment we're living through now. Alexandra, you've been one of the editors of a yearly publication which is called Security Radar 2025, Europe Lost in Geopolitics. And that radar, that report, was actually presented at Munich Security Conference just a few weeks ago. I looked at it and I saw quotes like, "The world is entering an era of wars and conflicts. The new Cold War between the US and China. European security order is becoming complicated." So it does look concerning. It does look like, I mean, as we heard in your first remarks, there's quite a lot happening. So what are your main takeaways of this year's radar? And also maybe what surprised you in its conclusions?
Yes, thank you for this question. Indeed, the Security Radar is a big security poll we are doing regularly in a host of OSCE countries. So just to name a few of them, we focused on some EU members such as Germany, France, Latvia, Poland, Italy. We also took the United States across the Atlantic, UK, which is not anymore a member of the EU, but also countries outside those alliances such as Georgia, such as Kazakhstan, Serbia, and also, of course, Russia and Ukraine. And it goes without saying that polling in countries during wartime is anything but a given. And it's interesting, and here I'll speak really about like general findings and something that we can generalize across countries. So basically the mean across all countries or average across all countries. One thing that struck me is that threat perceptions are not always mirrored. For instance, those members of the EU that we polled look at Russia as the main threat. Russians, however, rather perceive the United States as the primary adversary, primary threat. US citizens, by contrast, rather look at China as the main threat. And maybe it's not surprising given that it reflects actual politics going on in those countries. It shows how complicated the system is and how different those threat perceptions are. I think it is quite telling that for the United States, Russia is not the main focus, neither for the citizens nor in the actual policy, like we see in Trump's attempt, I would say, at the rapprochement with Russia. I was also struck by the fact that even before Trump got elected, we polled, did the fieldwork in the autumn of 2024, when we asked US citizens whether the US should continue providing security for Europe. Majorities said yes, but under certain conditions. So most people in the United States, especially if they vote Republican Party, they want Europe to pay its fair share, or they even want Europe to contribute to US security expenditure. So it's very interesting, this mercantilist, kind of very pragmatic stance that Trump has been pushing, and he shocked many European leaders with that. It's actually deeply rooted in American society, this feeling that one has been treated unfairly, that Europe was free riding on the United States. It's quite widespread. So about half of US citizens say that, and the share is much, much higher among Republican voters. So these were the findings that struck me on this kind of transatlantic track. And maybe just to add one more that I found interesting, if you look at Russia, a big majority, over 60%, believe that their country got strengthened through the war. And I think this is quite indicative because most other countries that we asked actually see them weakened. They also see the EU as weakened. Maybe NATO got a little bit stronger in the opinion of most people that we polled, but usually the war is seen as liability, as something that weakened your own country. And Russians are among the few who say, actually, we got stronger. And this tells us quite something about the resilience of the society, who still, I wouldn't say, I don't know whether they actually support the war, but don't necessarily see the cost of the war as very high.
Well, thank you, Alexandra, for sharing the conclusions. Like some of the conclusions of the report. Well, the report is obviously it's very comprehensive and it's very big. It's a few hundred pages, and we'll get to the question of what's happening in Russia and to the question of the war in Ukraine a bit later in our discussion. But now I'd like to ask Ivan. So Ivan, what's your take on countries' attitudes and changing countries' policies with regard to security agenda, and what drives these changes, you think?
Well, I would probably first comment what Alexandra just said. You know, they're speaking about Russian attitudes, who is the main adversary. You know, just until recently, the United States was certainly the main adversary. You know, Europe has no agency according to Russian propaganda. But right now, with the Trump administration, you can see how quickly the propaganda changed the narrative, and now the United States is almost ally, while the Europe is the main adversary. Europe is a, you know, inherently fascist and Nazi, you know, group of countries. And I just, you know, this morning I've seen this new cartoon caricature, which is Russian foreign intelligence service put on its website, you know, like reminding the caricatures of the Second World War, when that the Soviet Union and the United States together killed, you know, Nazi Germany, and now they put it United States and Russia are attacking Nazi Europe, and that is, you know, a big change of the narrative, and it just took overnight to correct the old meaning. I guess that is still the challenge to the Russian, if not to propaganda. Propaganda is very flexible, but the challenge to the whole narrative of what is Russia doing, because if Russia is not fighting against the United States, well, what the point? I mean, what's the point for Putin or for Russia of that war? Because, well, it looked like that was a war for a position of one of the, you know, global poles. But in this case, you still are somehow, you know, if you're allied to the United States, you are a minor ally. You know, it's by definition, and that means that you are not a pole, not opposing pole, and that's actually creates some, you know, challenges in the long run. But in the short run, and the, you know, these weeks, it's like a very striking change of the narrative. In the United States, you know, with Trump and with all of that, I've already mentioned that was an idea that, okay, the United States, you know, for American public, for both Republicans and Democrats, the main goal of the foreign policy always was to fight for freedom, to fight against totalitarianism and to fight against totalitarian ideologies and to defend liberties and democracy. And what it looks like, not many Americans, not all Americans, believes that the fight against or to deterrence of Russia or fight against Russia is exactly this type of fight. Again, when the Soviet Union was a communist country, it was easily to ascribe to the Soviet Union every evil that the Americans hated. It's not as easy to ascribe to Russia, like one of the authoritarian countries. There are many authoritarian countries around the globe, but they are not communists. They are not the same type of threat to liberal ideals. You know, it's strange to understand during this bloody war, but it's still, you know, this is a public opinion which is rooted in American ideas about foreign policy, what foreign policy is for. And that is why, okay, China is still a bigger threat, not only because it's economically threatening, but because China is still communist. You can ascribe to China all of these, evils which the Soviet Union possessed, and Russia does not possess. And this is also a change we should understand why American public opinion is not as vigilant as European one, and while still they probably many people support what Trump is doing in terms of his change of policies towards this European war.
Maybe a straight up follow-up question to this. You started your comments with saying that like Russia's reaction to changing attitudes in the US is all about positioning Russia and US together against Europe. Do you think that kind of picture and that kind of perception is known in the US, and what is the reaction towards it?
It's mostly Russian. It's not known in the United States, but I do think that it may find, well, at least some supporters in the United States, and of course among people who support Trump. But also there is also one of the traditions. I'm a historian. I look, that was also repeating narrative in American foreign policy, that Europe is dangerous, and from time to time, through two centuries of Russian-American relations, Russia was a big ally of the United States in fighting against European evils. It was, from, I don't know, if not Napoleonic Wars, it was not yet the time, but during the Crimean War, when the United States supported Russia some way, during the Second World War, definitely, and even before that, it was some prophecies of the founding fathers who said that Russia and the United States are the last hopes of the humankind, while Europe is actually the continent was lagging behind, and stop the progress. So that is this type of thinking is a part of American discourse, of American legacy. It's not on the surface, but it does present here. So Russian portrayal of the conflict as a alliance between Russia and the United States against Europe, while it's definitely not popular, but it can find resonance in American public. So it's just a matter of time.
Right, it's very interesting. I also find the historic references you made to be extremely insightful, and also something that is probably not well known as of now. Going back more specifically towards the ongoing war in Ukraine, Alexander, according to your research and according to your estimations, how are various clusters within various societies estimate and evaluate military help to Ukraine, military support to Ukraine, and how also do you see political parties within various countries and various political contexts working with their voters, and what kind of stories do they tell their voters about a need to increase military spending to Ukraine or maybe decrease it? So how do you see, what kind of trends do we have there?
Pivotal question at the time when American support is doubtful and European coalition of the willing is trying to get its act together, both to keep supporting Ukraine and also to selling to their publics that we need to spend more on defense. So generally we see in the security radar, so here again I refer to this public opinion data that we gathered, we see that European populations are not averse to keep supporting Ukraine, but there are some worries and fears connected to this policy. And as you mentioned, there are different groups within societies, and I'll come to this in a moment. So to find out those groups, we decided to kind of cross-tabulate two questions. One of them is about potential cooperation with Russia, kind of yes and no, should we cooperate with Russia or not, and whether we should continue sending weapons to Ukraine, yes or no. And here unequal clusters come about. We have the so-called determined, they support more weapons for Ukraine, absolutely oppose any cooperation with Russia. They can be seen as the staunchest supporters of Ukraine. And this segment of society is particularly big, but short of an absolute majority in Sweden, in the United Kingdom, in Latvia. We have on the kind of opposite side of the spectrum, so-called Russia's friends, as we call them. They oppose weapon deliveries to Ukraine and they want cooperation with Russia. You would think that this is a minority everywhere, but in fact, this sector is quite big, about 20% in Germany, about 20% also in Italy, 14% in France. So it is a considerable minority in some places. And obviously these people, it will be hard to persuade them to support Ukraine and to have a tough stance on Russia. Then we have what I think is the most interesting wobbly political middle. It's the cluster of the so-called reluctant. They oppose both closer cooperation with Russia and supporting Ukraine with weapons. This sector is, not every person in the sector, of course, but these people tend to be somewhat younger. There are many female in the sector, and we see this segment of society particularly prominent in places like Germany, France, Italy, and even Poland, which is maybe quite surprising. And almost as big is the sector of how we call them unaffiliated. These are people who do not have an opinion or refuse to answer on one of those questions. So this is kind of also part of what I conceive the political middle. These are people that are maybe overwhelmed by the challenges of the war. Maybe they have withdrawn from politics altogether. Maybe they find the whole situation way too complicated. And just to mention briefly, but the sector plays really a little role, are the so-called opportunists. They support both closer cooperation with Russia and somewhat counterintuitively more weapons for Ukraine. This segment is very small in most cases, apart from the United States, which is maybe surprising. Some 15% in the United States say, yeah, we do both. So in other words, on the one hand, we see that formulation of joint policy within the coalition of the willing, be it with the United States or without, is quite difficult because this joint vision is anything but a given. And to make things even more complicated, if we look within societies like we just attempted, we see that there's no unified opinion within any given society, and that this undecided political middle that is kind of not quite sure what the right course of action is. They don't have an opinion or just reluctantly support Ukraine. They don't want to cooperate with Russia. This political middle is, we think, the most promising group of people to be addressed. And here we looked at how these people from this political middle think about a whole range of other issues to actually try to answer your question, Angelina. Which narratives can our politicians devise or address, or which policies can they implement to persuade these people to support the current course of action? And maybe just to give you a few examples, one of them is fears, worries and fears. Many people in this political middle fear for their security. They fear a new war in Europe. And they think that Europe cannot defend itself without the US. We also had the question whether Europe should become more independent of the United States. And surprisingly, there's actually a broad consensus across clusters. So even our kind of tough fringes, both the determinists, the determined and Russia's friends, they all want, for various reasons, obviously the Russia's friends more out of the anti-Americanism that is prevalent among those people, but they all think, and the political middle also think, we should be more independent of the United States. And this is, to me, one of the areas where I would advise politicians to look at this, to actually seize the momentum of public mood, that people are both worried and want Europe to become stronger, but want it to be more independent of the United States. So this is actually the moment for the strategic autonomy I was referring to in the beginning. Referring to the war, if I may, there seems to be a consensus issue or consensus potential in addressing the war against Ukraine as an issue of a breach of international law. We have seen that grandiloquent narratives such as the fight between democracies and autocracies, or framing via issues of social justice or generally justice, war against peace, they have not quite managed to galvanize public support. This is very much what the Biden administration attempted. And I don't say this was wrong or didn't bring anything, but we see a more promising approach in arguing that Russia needs to be punished and Ukraine needs to be supported because, in fact, Russia breached international rules. And this is why we help Ukraine by sending weapons, by strengthening their defense, and on the other hand, by sanctioning the rule breaker, who is Russia. We also see among all groups, so again, this is a potential unifying narrative and a unifying policy, that people are very war fatigued and they expect and hope for a diplomatic solution in the conflict. Only very small minorities in all clusters actually expect Ukraine to win the war. So we kind of hope for a Ukrainian victory, but we do not believe this is going to happen. So in other words, this belief that the war is going on or is going to continue for a long time, prevalent across all clusters, and the wish for a diplomatic solution, coupled with necessity to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity, like in the case of deterrent, this can be the right course of action. So politicians in Europe, in order to maintain a coalition of supporters within their societies for their policy, can argue that we need to maintain Ukrainian sovereignty and maintain its ability to defend itself against future aggression, and also ensure its future prosperity and long-term reconstruction as one goal for the European efforts. If we look at what's actually going on, this coalition of the willing is trying to signal virtue and maybe at least passively to support the peace process the Trump administration attempted to start, but there was no real initiative. And maybe a good advice for European policymakers would be commit actually to ending this war diplomatically, make proposals, remind of this formula that it's important not only to win the war, but to win the peace, put the emphasis on the reconstruction that is tied to the long-term process of entering the European Union. These are issues, it's not just my expert opinion, again, these are issues that we see in the data, what is important to people, and especially to those who are in the political middle, tend to vote parties of the political middle, but are not quite decided in their opinions. So kind of to sum up, the fairly small but resolute segment of people who support Ukraine, no matter what comes, the so-called determined, we have them on board anyway. Russia's friends, it's very hard to get them. This is a notable but a minority in most societies. And the big, wobbly political middle that is very undecided, they can be addressed with policies targeted at keep on supporting Ukraine, keep on punishing Russia with sanctions on the basis of breach of international law, and actually pushing for a diplomatic initiative, not just waiting and seeing what Trump is going to achieve.
Ivan, would you like to add anything from the US perspective?
Yes, just a little bit. Thank you, Alexandra, for such a comprehensive description of the public opinions. Yes, I also see this change of the vision that this is not a support of democracy versus autocracy, but more the punishment of somebody who breached the rule of law, international rules, international security, and that is. But from this point of view, Trump administration again less interested in doing that, because Trump, accepts, and he himself said that the United States, frequently breaks the international laws. It's his opinion. That is okay. These big countries can do it. And this is unlike Biden or unlike Democrats who usually say that the international rules are important. For Trump, it's not as important as for Democrats. So he is not subscribed to this type of war to reestablish international rules, or maybe he even wants to change the international rules himself. So his own goal is to replace the existing international system with something else. We don't know what he wants to achieve in this way, but definitely he doesn't want to sustain, to keep the current international rules. So in this case, Trump is really ally of Putin in terms of changing the international system to something else, and that makes it's a difficult choice for Europeans. And don't know. Again, looking back, we are getting to some period before the Cold War, to some to European concept of the 19th century. I don't know, will it be workable to look into system of international relations like it existed during, Queen Victoria or whatever. But it's definitely not the period of Soviet-American Cold War, and that is, I think that we should just start thinking about the international order without American umbrella, American security guarantees, and how it can emerge, what can emerge instead of this this world order which existed for the last 80 years.
Maybe a follow-up question to you, Ivan. So if we could imagine that order, right, something which is a new security infrastructure globally, what details could it have, and what could be the possible political implementation in order to counteract in ever-increasing militarization? I mean, would you have any ideas?
Oh, that's a good question. It's very difficult to speak about the future, especially if you're a historian and look mostly backward. And well, it depends on what moment we are speaking, because right now we have, pending problem with stopping the war, with doing something with the Russian aggression. So that is something which cannot be, which prevent us to speaking about the long-lasting consequences and what should we build after the war. But if you speak in the long run, if you think about how the future architecture or design of the international system should be organized, there are several ideas which I think are basic for that. And if you speak about Russia, that Russia should be part of those agreements. That was probably not Putin's Russia. We are speaking about long run, but Russia should not be excluded from that. That's one of the big problems in the 90s. And there is a good book by William Hill, I guess, that with the title "No Place for Russia." That was a problem, which was, Russia was isolated, Russia was left outside of the architecture of international security, and that's actually was one of the context of what happened in the recent years, and that is an important part of the long-term solution. I would also say that that's long-term solution will be, as we see with American withdrawal, will not rely on just one military power, on one country which is responsible for international peace, and that is actually involves some rise of militarization. It's not a decrease of militarization, but rise of it. European countries with spend more on the defense, it will be more military spending in Europe, and that's definitely, I don't see how to escape this with a withdrawal of America from the security guarantees. I cannot see how to get rid of that. But if you think backwards, think about the early 90s. There was, it still is, but almost forgotten, organization for security and cooperation, in Europe. That is an organization which used to be, people in the early 90s, especially the Soviet and early post-Soviet elites, did rely on the OSCE as a new organization which should ensure the European security, and instead of that, NATO became a main player in this in the security infrastructure of Europe, and that is, I don't know, was it a mistake or how we should judge it now, but we see that Russia was a part of OSCE, it still was a part of OSCE, but it never was a part of NATO, so it was something like Organization of Security and Cooperation, or something new on its place, but just that something that would include the major players should play its role. And the other factor which didn't exist 30 years ago, but it exists now, it's a big elephant in the room, is China and Chinese global ambitions, how they will project it on the European security. So far, China does not look very interested in Europe, but China is already became power number 2. We see the start of the Chinese-American trade war, and that's something that will have a security security influence on the European security in the future. We don't know yet what type of influence, what type of impact this Chinese ambition will have, but they definitely will, and that is something which actually makes the situation different from the 19th century, which I referred to earlier. In the 19th century, everybody were in Europe. All the big countries, all the powers were in Europe. Even the United States was a marginal and outsider in that concert. But now this is not European concert; it's a global concert. And that is China and maybe India. India also has ambitions, and if it's increase its economy, which is possible, I guess that's the whole global concert will move from Europe to some other places. The main decision place of decision making will move to outside of Europe and outside of the United States, maybe.
Well, from what you say, it sounds like, at least in the short term, we will not be able to avoid increase on military spending.
Unfortunately, I don't think this possible yet.
Yeah. So, Alexandra, in your view, this increased military spending, does it come into direct conflict with, for example, social spending on infrastructure, education, medicine? Do we see a shift in that, also including public opinions?
I think it's very important to address this guns versus butter question, as it is referred in political science. So defense expenditure versus social expenditure. Well, I tend to think of a state budget as a pie, right? So it's a fixed pie. And obviously, if you start spending more on one area, such as defense, you most likely will have less money for other areas. And in fact, this is exactly the kind of thought experiment we asked our respondents across countries to think about. So if they had to choose how to spend limited government budget, what would they prioritize? And maybe not very surprisingly, across all countries and across the clusters I was referring to previously, across all clusters, people favor social and economic expenditure over defense if they had to choose. So this is something that is very important to keep in mind when you formulate policy. So security is obviously a broader term. It's not just defense and military alone. It's of course also social security, and it's the coherence and stability of our societies, and people realize it. So we cannot address our security just from the perspective of hard security and defense. It's very important, and for me as a left-leaning intellectual, it's kind of hard to reconcile it with my own values, but I realize that the global and European security situation is such that we seem not to have another choice than to revamp our militaries, and it's important, and it's obvious that more money will be flowing there, but we should not do so, at least in Europe, at the expense of our European living standard. I think that our actual stability and strength, and this is what our respondents also think, so this is an opinion backed up by public opinion, that maintaining a high level of social security and stability, this underpins the cohesion and actually strengthens the resilience of European societies and democracies. So it will be key to the security and peace on the continent. And in fact, the OSCE has been mentioned. I'm very glad, because we are in the anniversary year of this organization. It's this year 50 years since the adoption of the seminal Helsinki Final Act in 1975 that basically put the beginning to the end of the Cold War. It was the détente area and everything that led up to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and communist bloc, and then the great time of the end of history, 1990s, where, like Ivan described, we all hoped maybe for some more cooperative solutions. Right now, it doesn't look like we can just jump back to this thinking, but the general approach to security by the OSCE, the broad understanding of security, it's just one of the baskets is military. The other basket is economy and environment, by the way. And of course, human security, aspects of human rights, democracy, etc. And I think this holistic view of security is something that no matter how the events will unfold, this is something we need to keep in mind. And thus, back to your question, we need to keep in mind when dividing up the pie. And maybe just to add on the German example, I think this is kind of an exception, this relaxation of the debt brake by the still old parliament and the incoming government. It's one way to go. If you want to have both, you kind of expand the pie, but most likely it will be not always possible for all countries. So it's necessary to balance social spending and defense expenditure in order to stay resilient and secure.
You also mentioned environmental spending, and my next question is connected to global cooperation and global action on the so-called neutral subjects or cooperation for the global good, for example, for issues of climate change, biodiversity, but also humanitarian aid. So how do you, Alexandra, and then also you, Ivan, see the future of these cooperation tracks at the time when we see a lot more of countries just, retreat into their caves, so to say, right? And we see a more growing self-focus. I think in your report, the security radar, there's also this notion of my country first. Yeah, right, it's mentioned a lot. So if everyone is retreating back to their houses and to their households and looking what kind of pie we have, and what kind of concerts we can play with the other countries. So where is the place for cooperation on the issues for the benefit of the whole humanity and the planet?
Yeah. Absolutely. There is an understanding that despite current hard security challenges and the big rift that is going through Europe, big rift with Russia, there is a need to collaborate on global challenges that affect us all, and climate change ranks really high among the worries of the people when we ask them. And majorities across all countries, really all countries without exception, say that international collaboration is key to address global challenges such as climate change beyond rivalries in our area, in other areas. So I would say this is good news. If you look at the countries, how they generally perceive climate change, I would like to highlight the Russian exceptionalism, perhaps. So we basically asked how to deal with climate change, do everything that we can to stop, or rather just to adapt, or do nothing. Climate change is okay, fine, we live with it. And Russia is the only country where a considerable amount of people, 26%, say, just live with it, we do nothing. And almost the same percentage say we do everything we can to stop it. So since we're speaking now about Russia and how we can imagine collaborating with Russia and maybe some other rivals on the other side of the barricades, so to speak, then this causes some concern, I think. If among the Russian population there's no widespread understanding that climate change needs to be tackled, then maybe there's not such a big space for collaboration. But at least, despite the rivalry, there is an understanding that we should. Maybe last aspect on this that somewhat adds a negative aspect. When we ask people, like a distributive question again, with climate change leading to instability, my country should prioritize securing its borders and competing in the global market for natural resources and new technologies. Here also quite many people, actually almost in every place, majorities said yes to this question. So climate change is seen not only as a challenge that needs to be tackled jointly, but it is also seen as a liability when you have this my country first approach. We need to, secure our borders, we need to compete for resources. So I'm not entirely sure whether there's a good basis, given those rivalries and this new Cold War kind of mentality, this division of the world into blocks that we see throughout the responses in our survey. I'm not sure whether it's a very solid basis for addressing planetary challenges together, such as climate change.
Well, that's actually very interesting. I think also your argument how climate risks might lead to further security risks, right? And actually bring up further spending on borders, right? Like you say. That's actually a very interesting observation. Ivan, what's your take on this? Cooperating on the global good issues at the times of increased security concerns?
Yeah, we're still living in this long trend of nationalization and renationalization of international relations, which is, which changed the almost forgotten globalization trend, more than 20 years ago. And we still, and with this, privatization or nationalization of foreign policy, this any type of international cooperation for the global threats are looking less looking less possible, I guess, that it looked like 20 years ago. On the other hand, there are also a different approach, which I guess shared by many people, that if you don't deal with climate change, if you don't try to prevent it somehow, to stop it, you should deal with the consequences. And there are already consequences. So there are people in the Pacific which are just losing their countries. That's islands which are Mariana Islands and some other Marshall Islands, which are almost flooded already. The people are resettled here to the United States. There are special program to resettle people from the islands to the United States, and this is already the start of the big global migration, which will definitely be one of the first results of the climate change. If it's migration for food, for just from the flooded territories to the continental masses. So that is something that every country should deal, and that maybe in just more thinking about these consequences would be would influence in two ways. I mean, there is one that Alexandra mentioned, that it may be increasing securitization, building borders and not letting people in, or actually some type of a different dealing with the questions of citizenship, migration, and all of that, because you should do something with millions and millions of people who will be affected. And the other thing, which is I still make sense to mention, the global cooperation is actually something. If you have the global challenge, that is something which can prevent or can make the small, relatively small disputes less important. That was many jokes. If some aliens, hostile aliens will come, the humankind will unite against those aliens. And the climate change is just a thing which many people does not believe is this kind of challenge. And this is something which, you mentioned Russia, not only Russia, in the United States, many people does not believe in climate change. That is actually, again, big portion of the Trump base do not believe in climate change, or saying that it's nothing better than that. So while people in Florida already suffering from, more hurricanes, and that is. But again, this is still, this type of challenge. If I do think that the global attitudes and the attitudes in the countries like Russia or in the United States, in the big countries which do not feel as much affected, or China, will probably start changing this mind. Will be, unfortunately, after the first catastrophe of that. When one archipelago will just disappear from the globe, and when the big migration will start, with some drought will kill people, unfortunately. Only big catastrophe will influence unfortunately, this big sinking of big groups of the population outside of these areas. And that is, this is not a prophecy, it's just my expectation that we will have the same type of fighting global climate change for few years more. Well, when more concerned Europeans will fight for doing something with climate change, and the countries like Russia or China or the United States will abstain from doing their part of the job, until something bad, really bad happens, and that will be an argument for everybody to change their mind. That is how it usually works in the global global public opinion. That's my take on that.
Interestingly, a lot of what you were just saying, Ivan, made me remember about the film Don't Look Up, and also about, right, how global catastrophes are being perceived, how they are being trusted, not trusted, and what our public and media and political takes on them are. Now, we spoke a lot about the present, we spoke a lot about the past, somewhat about the future, but then my final question to both of you is about your dreams. So if you could dream about the new global security infrastructure, what would that dream be? Alexandra?
Well, I'll join Ivan with his optimism and wish that Russia is part of this system. I absolutely agree. It's hard to imagine now that the war is ongoing, but since we are speaking about the distant future and a dream that I hope we still live to see to come true, I think that in the ideal world, in Europe, on this continent, we would live peacefully and deal with security issues in a cooperative way, jointly. That there will be a perception that your security depends on the security of others, and not in a negative way, in the sense there are threats and some competition and prisoner dilemma kind of games, but rather, this joint understanding that only if you think of interests of your neighbors and account for them and consult with them on a regular basis, you can have a cooperative environment. And this is where I would like to mention the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe again. I think even if it stopped existing in my dream, I would reinvent it. Maybe it's my bias because I live in Vienna, the place where the Secretariat is located, and the diplomats of the 57 participating states meet every Thursday, still on a regular basis, still despite the ongoing war. I believe that after the hot phase of the war is over, which in my dream is very soon, that the organization will play a role like it did in the past. The moment the weapons are silent, there is this important platform for exchange of ideas, for confidence building measures, for new arms control agreements, or going back to the previous ones from the era when we were actually reducing our stockpiles and thinking of risks emanating from weapons of all kinds, but particularly nuclear weapons. So I think in my dream, there would be still a forum, a revitalized diplomatic forum, where all European states, and for this matter also United States, even if they reduced their role and footprint in European security, where we will, in a cooperative way, with respect, with trust, speak about different interests in those areas and, well, negotiate in a peaceful way how we can balance those interests and how ultimately we can live in peace and find a good formula to balance the self-determination of each sovereign nation and the principle of alliances. Ideally, and this is maybe something that goes very much beyond the present moment, I imagine a world where there are no military alliances. So this would mean no military alliance around Russia and also no NATO. So I wish that only the organization like the OSCE would represent those countries in an equal manner, and there would be no military blocs that automatically can be perceived as a threat by those countries that are not members. This is a dream, but I'm very optimistic that in some distant future, we may live in Europe beyond military blocs and alliances.
Well, thank you for sharing your hopes with us, Alexandra. Ivan?
Well, yeah, thank you. I will probably join what Alexandra's hopes, and because I've also, I subscribe to everything that she just said. I would just add, maybe, if we are dreaming about the long distance future, I think that the nation states will lose much of its importance in the future. We are living in the period when the nation states are back. It looks like, okay, again, the major international problems are decided not by international organization, but nation state, and nation state conflict with each other, and they create their own, a lot of domestic narratives which are conflicting, including history. Again, as a historian, I know that each nation state has its own history, which are not compatible with the history of the neighbors. So that's problem. But on the other hand, we also see despite that this visible increase of the nation-state weight in the international and the global affairs, increase of the military spending and all of that, we also see the erosion of the base of the nation-state in every country. That's because it's no more in most of the countries, if you speak about Europe, about the United States and about Russia, it's no more like ethnically based states. Well, in some countries it still are, but not as much. It's no more the states which can base on the unified vision of the past. The nation history was one of the building blocks of the nation states 2 centuries ago, but no more unified nation history exists. So we see some erosion of the nation-state base from inside. And that is why I do think that in a generation from us, or maybe 2 generations from us, the nation-states will be changed radically. That will be something else. And that is actually will also imply the very different architecture design of the international and global security. And I do think, that will be this decrease of the nation-state power will lead to the rise of the international organizations, of the international networks, of the different type of institutes which go beyond the national borders. And that is important. It's just maybe last thing I want to say. We've seen how the existence of international institutes back in the 90s, back in even the last decade, did play a role in the domestic development of all the countries. We see how the countries like, Poland recently or Hungary, which everybody were speaking about this authoritarian drift, but still they they were inside the European community. They were limited by the institutes of European community, and that actually kept them out of from being like Russia under Putin recently. So it's kept the international institutes do play the role of the international support for the evolution of domestic institutes. And even for Russia, this European Court of Human Rights until the 2022 did play a role in the domestic development of Russia. So that is important to have these international institutes, to have different, not just one, not just OSCE or whatever. We have different institutes, maybe which unites different groups of countries, but they will increase. And economic exchanges should also increase. I guess that is other side. I'm not an economist, but I do think that it's important not only because it makes goods cheaper, but it's because it makes countries more interdependent. It's we see how Putin started his drift this way by pushing the Russian economy to self-reliance, and this is also very, I would say, alarming tendency of Trump administration, of Putin, the United States, to more of self-reliance. And some people are now already being afraid that is a way towards some big war. Well, I hope not. But we're speaking about the bright vision of the future, and I do think that will be the future with more international organizations, networks, and less nation states, and of course less military alliances. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. I mean, to me, it sounds like another very hopeful answer, and I can only hope that all 3 of us will get to see their dreams come true one day. Thank you so much for being today with us on IGRec Talks. I would like to remind you that I was talking to Alexandra Dienes, who is a senior researcher at the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in the Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace in Europe in Vienna, and Ivan Kurilla, who is a historian and professor at Wellesley College. I think we had an amazingly interesting discussion. We spoke about the current and the future global security architecture from military point of view, from security point of view, from political point of view, but we also spoke about sociology, we spoke about public opinion, we spoke about history. We even got to speak about pies and dividing the pies and producing and going to listen global concerts. Thank you once again, and thank you for staying with us.